The great hall of Thornfield went still the way a forest goes, still before weather. And in that stillness every servant lowered their head except one. The Dowager Duchess of Marwood stood at the foot of the staircase with her cane lifted, and the boy who had spilled the coal scuttle was on his knees at her feet, and the whole household had folded forward like wheat under a wind. Esther alone remained upright. She did not mean it as defiance. She had simply seen the cane begin its arc toward the boy, and her body had moved before her caution could stop it, and now she stood between the old woman and the child, with her chin level and her hands open at her sides. She could not say a single word in her own defense. She had not spoken a word aloud since she was 6 years old. The hall held its breath, and the Duchess turned her pale eyes upon the maid, who would not bow, and somewhere above them, on the landing, a man none of them had heard return stood watching with his gloved hand gone tight upon the rail. The household had learned long ago that the safest posture at Thornfield was a bent neck. Augusta Dowager Duchess of Marwood ruled the great house, the way frost rules a garden, quietly and completely, and the rule had outlasted 2 generations of footmen. She had buried a husband and outlived a son, and the only living heir was a grandson, who had spent 5 years abroad and away, and in his absence she had made the house entirely her own. The servants rose at 5 and worked until the candles guttered. They learned which floorboards announced her approach. They learned not to meet her eyes. A girl who held her gaze too long was a girl dismissed without a character, turned out onto the road with nothing, and everyone at Thornfield understood that a reference withheld was a sentence of slow ruin. So they bowed. They bowed at her entrance and her exit, at her praise, which was rare, and at her displeasure, which was not. Esther Vale had come to Thornfield 2 winters before, hired. Because she was cheap, and because the housekeeper believed a girl who could not speak would carry no gossip below stairs. She was 22, slight, with a stillness about her that the other maids first mistook for simplicity, and later came to understand as something else entirely. She had a plain brown stuff gown and a single gray shawl worn thin at the elbows, and a way of watching a room that missed nothing. She had lost her voice to a fever in her 6th year, the same fever that had taken her mother, and the village physician had called it a stillness of the throat and had no remedy for it. What remained to her was her hands, quick and certain, and her eyes, which spoke for her when people troubled to read them, and a small brass bell her mother had pressed into her palm in the last hour of her life. The bell had no clapper. It could not ring. Esther had never understood why her mother had given her a bell that could make no sound, and she had carried it in her apron pocket for 16 years without an answer. To the household she was simply the dumb girl, and the phrase followed her down every corridor. The undercook said it first, on Esther's first morning, not unkindly, but as a fact requiring no apology. The dumb girl could scour the pans. The dumb girl could carry up the breakfasts, and she would not chatter on the stair. The dumb girl could be sent into the Duchess's presence where a talking maid might say the wrong thing and be ruined for it. Esther had heard the label so many times that it had stopped wounding her, or so she told herself in the cold of her attic room, where she lay each night and listened to the wind and pressed the silent bell to her chest until she warmed it. She had decided long ago that the world's name for her was not her own name. She knew her name. Her mother had said it often enough, in the years when there had still been someone to say it. What the house did not know, because the house had never troubled to look, was that the dumb girl could read and write a fine, clear hand. Her father had been a curate before the drink took him, and in the years before everything fell away, he had taught his daughter her letters, and a girl who cannot speak learns very quickly the value of a written word. Esther kept a stub of pencil and a folded scrap of paper sewn into her hem. She used them seldom, because to most of the household a written note from a servant was an impertinence, and to the Duchess it would have been a provocation past forgiving. So she kept her letters secret, as she kept the bell secret, and she did her work, and she bent her neck with the rest of them until the morning the coal scuttle went over and a small boy knelt weeping at the foot of the great staircase. She had not planned to stand. She wished afterward that she could explain that, to make them all understand that it had not been courage, but something nearer to instinct, the same flinch that pulls a hand from a flame. The boy was 9 years old, a scullery child named Tom, and the coal had blackened the Duchess's hem, and the cane had come up, and Esther had crossed the hall and put herself in its path without any decision she could name. Now she stood, and the Duchess studied her, and the silence in the hall was the silence of people watching a thing they had no name for. No servant had ever stood between the Duchess and her temper. The thing was simply not done. And the maid who had done it could not even offer the apology that might soften it, could not stammer an excuse, could not beg. She could only stand and breathe and keep the boy behind her skirts. If you have ever wished to see what happens when one quiet person declines, just once, to fold, then stay with me. Because that morning at Thornfield was the beginning of everything that followed. The Duchess lowered her cane by a half-inch, no more. Her mouth thinned. And on the landing above, unseen by all of them, the man with his hand on the rail came down the stairs. He came down without hurry, and the sound of his boots on the marble turned every head but Esther's, because Esther could not afford to take her eyes from the cane. She felt the change in the room before she understood its cause, felt the servants stiffen and drop lower, and only when a shadow fell across the Duchess's face did she look and saw him. He was perhaps 31, tall, dark-haired, with a face that gave away nothing, a jaw set hard and gray eyes the color of slate before rain. He wore a traveling coat still dusted from the road, and he carried himself like a man who had not slept. The Duchess's expression flickered, recalculated, settled into something colder and more careful than the temper of a moment before. She inclined her head the smallest degree. "Your Grace," she said, and the words tasted of surprise she would not show. "We did not look for you until the spring." He did not answer her at once. He looked at the boy crouched behind the maid's skirts, and at the spilled coal, and at the cane still raised a half-inch from the floor, and at last at Esther herself, who stood her ground and met his eyes because she had no other language to offer him. Henry Ashford, the young Duke of Marwood, had come home to a house he had been glad to leave, and the first thing he had seen of it in 5 years was a servant girl shielding a child from his grandmother's stick. He held Esther's gaze a moment longer than was comfortable, a moment longer than was proper, and something moved behind his still face that none of them could read. Then he said, in a voice low and level, "You will not strike the boy." It was not addressed to Esther, it was addressed to the Duchess, and the hall heard it, and the hall understood that the order of things had shifted on its axis. The Duchess lowered the cane the rest of the way. She did it slowly, to make plain that she chose to, that she was not commanded, but she did it. Then she turned the full weight of her displeasure upon the maid. "This creature," she said, putting a careful distance between herself and the word, "has forgotten her place. She is the dumb girl from the kitchens. She does not speak, and she does not know her station, and I will have her gone by nightfall." The phrase landed in the hall like a coin dropped on stone. The dumb girl. Esther kept her chin level. She had heard it 100 times, but she had never heard it spoken in front of a duke, and she found that it stung in a place she had thought long since gone numb. Henry looked at her again. "Send the boy to the kitchens," he said. And he said of the maid, "She stays." Then he walked past all of them toward the library, and the household exhaled. And the Duchess stood very still, with 2 spots of color high on her cheeks, and Esther understood that whatever had just happened, she had become visible in a house that had spent 2 years declining to see her, and that visibility in such a house was a dangerous thing to own. The library at Thornfield was the only room the Duchess never entered, because it had belonged to her dead son, and she could not bear the smell of his books. It was here that Henry shut himself away in the days after his return, and it was here on the 3rd morning that Esther was sent with the coal and the kindling, because no other maid would go where the young Duke brooded. She built the fire as she had been taught, quietly, without looking at him, kneeling on the cold hearthstone and coaxing the flame with a patience that asked nothing of anyone. And she had nearly finished when she became aware that he was watching her from the wing chair by the window. She did not start, she had learned not to start. She set the last log and rose and turned to go, and his voice stopped her at the door. "You did a foolish thing in the hall," he said. She turned back. He was looking at her with that unreadable face, and she could not tell whether he meant to dismiss her after all. She did the only thing she could. She drew the stub of pencil and the scrap of paper from her hem, and she wrote 3 words in her fine, clear hand, and she crossed the room and laid the paper on the table beside his chair, and she stepped back. He read it. "The boy is 9. He read it twice. Then he looked up at her with an expression she had not seen on any face at Thornfield, an expression of a man encountering something he had not expected to find, and he said, "You write." She inclined her head. He was silent. A long moment. He turned the scrap of paper over in his fingers as though it were a thing of value. Most of the people in this house, he said, would have let the cane fall and told themselves it was none of their concern. He set the paper down. "What is your name?" She took back the pencil and wrote it, Esther Vale. He read it, and he said it aloud, Esther. And she felt the sound of her own name, in a stranger's voice, move through her like warmth through cold hands, and she did not understand why, and she went out quickly before her face could betray whatever was happening behind it. What she did not know, what no one in the house knew, was why the young Duke had come home in winter with no warning and no retinue, and why he did not sleep, and why he flinched from the sound of carriage wheels on the gravel drive. She would learn it later, in pieces, the way one learns the shape of a thing in the dark. For now she knew only that he had seen her, truly seen her, in a way that frightened her more than the Duchess's cane, because the cane threatened only her body, and this threatened the careful stillness she had built around her heart. She returned to the kitchens, and scoured the pans and told no one, because she could tell no one, and that night she lay in her attic room and took out the silent bell and held it. And for the first time in a long while, she wondered what her mother had meant by giving her a thing that could not ring. The Duchess did not forget. A woman who is ruled by fear for 30 years does not surrender an inch of ground without recording the cost of it, and Augusta had marked the maid down in the cold ledger of her mind as a debt to be collected. She could not turn the girl out. Not now. Not with her grandson's word laid plainly over the matter, for a duchess who defied a duke in his own house lost more than she gained. So she chose patience. She set Esther the heaviest work, the cold grates and the night slops, and the scrubbing of the long stone passage on her knees, in the dark before dawn, and she watched, and she waited for the girl to break or to err. Esther did neither. She did the work. She did it well, and she did it without complaint, because complaint was a thing she had never had the means to make, and the very silence the household had pitied became, in those weeks, her armor. The Duchess could not provoke a woman who could not be drawn into a word. It was in the second week that Henry saw the second thing, the thing that decided him, though he would not have called it deciding. He had taken to walking the grounds in the gray hours, when he could not sleep, and one morning before the house was awake, he came around the corner of the stable block and stopped, because the dumb girl was there in the cold, kneeling in the straw beside the old carriage horse that the household had marked for the knacker. The horse was lame and going blind and no longer of any use, and the Duchess had ordered it sold for what little its hide would bring. Esther had brought it an apple from her own meager breakfast, the single apple that was to have been her whole meal until noon, and she had cut it into quarters with the small knife she carried, and she was feeding it from her open palm a piece at a time, slowly, so the old animal would not have to hurry. Frost lay white on the straw, and her breath came in pale clouds, and she had no gloves, and her fingers were red with the cold. She rested her forehead against the great gray cheek, against the warm, living smell of the beast, and her lips were moving, though no sound came, and Henry understood that she was speaking to the creature in whatever language a silent woman keeps for the thing she loves. The horse turned its blind eye toward her, and leaned its heavy head into her hands as though it knew her. And perhaps it did, for she had been coming to the stable in the dark for longer than anyone guessed. He stood very still in the shadow of the wall. He did not interrupt. He watched her give her own food to a dying animal that could do nothing for her in return, that could not even thank her, and he felt something shift in his chest that he had believed, permanently. Still. Then he turned and walked back to the house before she could see him, and that day he gave a quiet order that the gray horse was not to be sold. She never knew it was he who saved the horse. She believed the housekeeper had relented. Henry knew, however, and the knowing changed the way he looked at her. And the change was the kind a watchful woman could not help but feel, even when she could not name its source. Across the following days their paths crossed as the paths of a duke and a maid will cross in a great house, at the library fire, on the stair, in the long gallery where she dusted the frames of his ancestors. He began to speak to her. Small things at first, the weather, the state of the road, a question about the fire. She answered with her pencil or her eyes or the small gesture she had refined over 16 years, and he learned to read her. And the learning was a thing he did without telling himself he was doing it. Once when she had written something dry about the Duchess's preference for cold rooms, the corner of his mouth moved almost nearly into something that on another man would have been a smile. And Esther carried that almost smile back to her attic and turned it over in the dark like a coin she had found in the road. The household noticed, because households always notice. The maids whispered. The footmen made their guesses. And the Duchess, who missed nothing that touched the dignity of her name, observed the young Duke's eyes follow the silent girl across a room and understood, with the cold clarity of her kind, that a danger far larger than a defied Cain was assembling itself under her roof. She summoned to Thornfield, with a letter written in her own hand, the daughter of an old friend, Lady Cecilia Ashworth, a beauty of the season, with a fortune behind her, and a manner polished to a high shine, and she installed her in the best guest chamber and let it be understood throughout the county that a match was as good as made. Lady Cecilia was everything Esther was not. She was tall and golden and gowned in silk the color of ice, and she had a laugh that filled the room, and she had been told since the cradle that she was the correct choice, and she believed it, and her belief was not stupidity but the simple confidence of a woman whose every expectation had always been met. Lady Cecilia found the silent maid amusing, in the way that a cat finds a wounded bird amusing. She had heard the household's name for the girl, and she used it with a smile that took the cruelty and dressed it as wit. "How quaint," she said one evening in the drawing-room, loud enough to carry, "that the Duchess keeps a dumb girl to tend the fires. One imagines it is restful having a servant who cannot answer back." The drawing-room laughed, because the Duchess laughed first. Esther, kneeling at the grate, did not turn her head. She built the fire and rose and left, and only Henry, standing at the window with a glass he had not touched, saw the color climb the maid's neck, and saw the steadiness of her hands as she set down the irons, and saw that she would not give them the gift of her distress. He set his glass down untouched and followed her out, and in the corridor he found her with her back against the cold stone and her eyes shut. And he stopped, and he said low, "Look at me." She opened her eyes. "They are wrong about you," he said. The words were plain and level, and he did not soften them. Then he said something that the household would have marveled at had they heard it, though it was only 4 words. "Come and walk tomorrow." It was not a request. It had the grammar of a command, yet she heard. Underneath it, the thing he could not say, and her body heard it, before her mind allowed it, and her pulse moved in her throat where no voice lived. They walked the following afternoon, in the long bare avenue of limes where the whole county could see them, and find nothing improper in a duke taking the air with a servant carrying his books. And it was there, among the wet leaves and the grey light, that the wound came out. He did not mean to tell her. He had not told anyone in 5 years. She could not interrupt, and she could not exclaim, and she could not offer the cheap comforts that other people offered, And perhaps it was the very safety of her silence that opened him, the knowledge that whatever he said would go no further, because she had no means to carry it. He spoke of his wife Clara, he said, and the name came out of him like a stone out of a deep well. He had married her young, against his grandmother's wish, for love and nothing else, and the Duchess had never forgiven the girl her lack of fortune, and the house had made Clara's life a slow, cold misery. And one night 5 years ago, after a quarrel that Henry had begun, after words he had said in temper and could not now unsay, Clara had ordered the carriage in the dark and the rain and gone, and the carriage had gone off the flooded road at the river crossing, and they had brought her back to him in the morning. He had sent her into that night. The quarrel had been his. He had left England the week after the funeral because he could not bear the house that had killed her, and he had stayed away 5 years, and he had come home now only because the Duchess had written that she was dying, which was a lie, and he had not yet decided whether to forgive the lie or to thank it. He told Esther all of this in the Avenue of Limes in a voice that never rose, and at the end of it he said, "I do not know why I have told you this." And Esther took out her pencil and wrote slowly, and gave him the paper. "Because I cannot tell anyone, and because you needed to set it down." He read it. He folded the paper and put it inside his coat, against his chest, where she would later understand he carried it still, and he did not speak again until they reached the house. After that, the house became 2 houses. There was the house of the day, in which the Duchess pressed the match with Lady Cecilia, and the dinners grew longer and the silver brighter, and the dumb girl carried the dishes and bent her neck and was not seen. And there was the other house, the house that existed only in stolen ordinary moments, at the library fire, where he read aloud to her because he had discovered she loved to be read to, and could not read aloud to herself, in the gallery where they stood too close before a portrait of a woman with a kind face, on the stair at dusk where his hand once found hers in the dark, and neither of them moved it away for the length of 3 breaths, nothing improper passed between them. The ceiling of it was a gloved hand held a moment too long, a forehead nearly resting against a shoulder, and then withdrawn, a look that lingered past the place where looks are meant to end. The charge of it filled the spaces where words could not go, and Esther, who had lived 16 years in silence, discovered that there was a kind of speech that needed no voice at all, and that she had been fluent in it all along and had only lacked someone willing to listen. She also knew it could not last, and the knowledge was a cold stone in her chest that no fire warmed. She was a maid, he was a duke. The county had its match already made, and the Duchess had her will, and the world did not bend for the likes of Esther Vale. She told herself this each night with the silent bell pressed to her breast. She told herself that she would take the memory of the avenue and the library, and the 3 breaths on the stair, and she would keep it, and it would have to be enough, because nothing more was possible, and a wise woman did not break her own heart, reaching for the impossible. What she did not yet know was that the Duchess had reached the limit of her patience, and that a woman who rules by fear when she feels the ground move beneath her does not grow gentle, she grows dangerous. It was the night of the great dinner that the Duchess made her move, and she made it in the one place where the Maid had no defense, in the full glittering company of the county, assembled in the great hall under the blazing chandeliers. 30 guests sat at the long table, and Lady Cecilia sat at the young Duke's right hand, in ice-blue silk, and the Duchess presided at the foot in diamonds that had been in the family 4 generations, and the dumb girl stood against the wall with the other servants, ready to carry and to clear and to be invisible. The Duchess had planned it carefully. Over the soup she let fall, to the table at large, that it had come to her attention that a servant in the house had been carrying tales, writing them down in secret and passing them about, slandering her betters with a pencil since she could not do it with her tongue. There were gasps, heads turned, and the Duchess looked down the long table to where Esther stood frozen against the wall. And she said, in a voice pitched to carry to every ear, "There she is, the dumb girl." Quote. The 3rd time the label was spoken, and the cruelest, because this time it came dressed as an accusation that could ruin her past any mending, and Esther had no voice to deny it. and a written denial would only prove the Duchess's claim that she wrote in secret. The hall waited. The Duchess produced from beneath her hand a folded scrap of paper and held it up between two fingers like a thing diseased. The candlelight of 100 flames caught the diamonds at her throat and threw small, hard points of light across the ceiling. "I have here," she said, "a sample of the creature's writing found in the library where she had no business to be." She unfolded it with great care, smoothing the creases, letting the room lean toward her. She read it aloud, and the words she read were not Esther's, were a coarse mockery of the guests assembled. Vicious little lines that named this lady's gown and that gentleman's gambling and the Duchess's own supposed infirmities in a clumsy spite. Words Esther had never written and could never have written, and the hall stirred with disgust. And a fork was set down hard against a plate, and Lady Cecilia put a hand to her breast, and the trap closed. Esther stood against the wall, with her ruin being read aloud, in a voice not her own, from words not her own, and she could not speak. She could not speak. She had never in 16 years of silence felt the weight of it as she felt it now. The whole bright, cruel room turned toward her and her throat a sealed door, and she felt the tears come and despised them and could not stop them. And the Duchess watched the tears with satisfaction, because tears were a confession the room would read as guilt. It was the lowest moment of Esther's life, lower than the fever, lower than her mother's death, lower than the long, cold years of being no one. She reached into her apron without deciding to, the way she had stood in the hall without deciding to, and her fingers closed around the silent bell, the bell that could not ring. And she understood at last, in the worst moment, the thing her mother had been telling her for 16 years. Her mother had given her a bell with no clapper, because her mother had known a voice is not the only thing that can be heard. Esther took the bell from her pocket, and she did not ring it because it could not ring, but she held it up in her open palm, so that the candlelight caught the brass, and she looked down the length of the great table past the Duchess, to the man at the head of it, and she let him see it, and she let him see her, and she did not look away. Henry rose from his chair. He did it slowly, and the legs of the chair scraped the floor in a silence so complete that the sound was enormous. Every face turned to him. The Duchess's words died in her mouth. He looked at the scrap of paper in his grandmother's hand, and he said, in a voice level and carrying, "That is not her hand." The Duchess began to speak. He went on, over her which no one in that house had ever done. "I have read a great deal of her writing," he said. "I have it here." And he drew from inside his coat the folded paper Esther had given him in the Avenue of Limes, the paper he had carried against his chest for 3 weeks, and he unfolded it, and he laid it on the table beside the Duchess's forgery. And the two hands were nothing alike, the one fine and clear and the other a clumsy, coarse imitation. And the whole table could see it, and the Duchess's face went the color of old paper. He came down the length of the great hall. He did not hurry. He passed his grandmother, and he passed Lady Cecilia in her ice-blue silk, and he walked the whole length of the table to the wall, where the dumb girl stood with the silent bell raised in her open palm, and the tears bright on her face. And he stopped before her, and the Count he watched, and he took her hand, the one that held the bell, and he closed his own hand around it. Then he turned to the room. He spoke 6 words, and he spoke them once, and they ended the matter for good and all. "This is the woman I will marry." The hall did not breathe. Lady Cecilia's hand fell from her breast. And the Duchess, who had ruled Thornfield by fear for 30 years, who had buried a husband and outlived a son and bent an entire household to the angle of her will, opened her mouth and found that she had nothing in it, no word, no cane, no cold, clever sentence for the first time in the memory of anyone present. She looked at her grandson, and she looked at the maid, and she looked at the 2 papers, lying side by side, where the whole county could read the lie in her own performance, and something in her face came apart, not into cruelty and not into rage, but into the small bewildered collapse of a person whose every certainty has just been proven false in front of the only audience whose opinion she had ever valued. She sat down. She had not meant to sit down. Her hand found the table and she lowered herself into her chair, and an old woman who had been monstrous for 30 years was, for one moment, simply old. No one humiliated her further. Henry did not need to. He had done the one sufficient thing, and he did no more. And that restraint was itself a kind of mercy, and the county which had assembled to witness a maid destroyed found itself witness to something it had not expected, and would talk of for years. The guests began awkwardly to find their feet. Lady Cecilia, to her credit, recovered her composure with the trained grace of her station, and was gone from Thornfield by the following noon. And if she wept on the road north, no one at the great house ever knew it, and the Duchess made no further word against the marriage, because there was no word left to make, and she knew it. Esther stood in the center of the great hall with her hand in the Duke's hand and the silent bell between their two palms, and she discovered that she was being seen by 30 people at once, and that for the first time in her life, it did not frighten her, because the only seeing that mattered had already happened, weeks before. In a cold stable at dawn over a dying horse, and neither of them had needed a single word for it. If Esther's silence has stayed with you, stay a moment longer for the end of it, because the story does not close in the great hall. It closes where such stories ought to close, in the quiet after. They were married in the spring, in the small gray church in the village, with the lime trees coming into leaf along the avenue, and the old gray carriage horse, fat now and idle in a green paddock, watching over the wall. It was a small wedding by the standards of a duke. Esther wore a gown of soft cream not borrowed, the first new gown of her life, and she carried no great bouquet, but a single sprig of something her mother had once grown. The Duchess attended. She sat near the front in her diamonds, smaller than she had been, and she did not speak. But when the curate asked who gave this woman, it was discovered that the old woman had quietly arranged the settlement that made the maid a fit bride in the eyes of the law. And whether she did it from softening, or from pride, or from the simple exhaustion of a fight she had lost, no one could say, and Esther, who had reason enough to hate her, chose not to ask. Some deaths are better left uncollected. The boy Tom, who had knelt at the foot of the staircase a winter before, scattered petals down the aisle and grinned the whole way. Henry learned, in the slow seasons that followed, to read every silence of his wife, as other men read speech, the lift of an eyebrow that meant she was amused, the stillness that meant she was moved past the reach of any pencil, the particular tilt of her head that meant she disagreed, and would set it down in writing later. Esther learned that to be heard she had never needed a voice, only a single person willing to listen with his whole attention, and that she had found him. The house changed around them. The servants rose later, and bent their necks less, and the long stone passage was scrubbed by a girl who was paid a fair wage, and called by her name, and the boy Tom was put to learning his letters in the afternoons, because the new Duchess had asked it of her husband, with a note laid quietly beside his coffee. And in the evenings, when the work was done and the fire was lit, the new Duchess of Marwood would sit in the library that had once belonged to a dead man and been forbidden to the living, and her husband would read aloud to her from whatever book she chose. And sometimes she would stop him with a hand on his sleeve and take up her pencil and write some small, dry observation that made the corner of his mouth move into the smile he gave to no one else. She kept the bell. She set it on the mantel in the library, where the firelight could reach it, the small brass bell with no clapper that could make no sound, and on the worst nights when the old grief of carriage wheels still found him in his sleep, she would take it down and press it into his hand and close his fingers around it, and he would understand. It said the thing she had no other way to say, the thing her mother had known and given her 16 years before either of them could need it. That a voice is not the only thing that can be heard, that the quietest people in any room are often the ones with the most to say, and that the world's name for a person is never, in the end, the same as their own. On the first snowfall of their first winter, as man and wife, Esther stood at the library window with her husband's arm about her, and watched the white come down over the avenue of limes and settle on the wall of the green paddock, where the old gray horse stood blowing steam into the cold. And she thought of her mother, and of the long silent years, and of the morning a cane had come up, and her body had moved before her caution could stop it. On the mantel behind them, the small brass bell caught the last of the firelight. It did not ring. It had never needed to. Thank you for staying until the very end. If Esther's story moved you, leave a word below for the quietest person you know and carry it gently into your evening.